The dusty streets of Tombstone, Arizona carried whispers that autumn of 1887. Every saloon from Phoenix to Tucson buzzed with tales of Martha Caldwell, the enigmatic widow who lived on the outskirts of town with her peculiar companion. What made Martha's story legendary wasn't her beauty, though her raven-black hair and piercing green eyes could stop any cowpoke in his tracks. It wasn't her wealth either, despite owning the largest ranch in Cochise County. No, what made Martha Caldwell famous throughout the territory was her impossible challenge and the magnificent gray wolf that roamed freely around her property. Hook 1. But here's what nobody knew about that wolf. It wasn't just any ordinary predator. Hidden beneath its thick fur was a secret that would shake the very foundations of everything people believed about Martha Caldwell and her tragic past. The challenge itself seemed simple enough. Martha would stand on her wraparound porch each morning at precisely 9 o'clock, her calico dress rustling in the desert breeze, and call out to any man brave enough to listen. "Catch my wolf without using rope, and I'll marry you and give you half my land." The rules were straightforward: no ropes, no nets, no traps. Just man versus beast in the most honest way possible. The wolf, a massive creature with silver-tipped fur and eyes like molten amber, would appear as if summoned by some ancient magic, padding silently from behind the main house to sit beside Martha's rocking chair. Dozens had tried. Jake Morrison, the toughest bronco buster from Flagstaff, arrived with confidence and leather gloves, thinking he could wrestle the beast with his bare hands. The wolf had simply looked at him with those intelligent eyes and trotted away, disappearing into the sagebrush before Jake could take 3 steps. Billy Fletcher brought raw steaks from his father's butcher shop in Prescott, certain he could lure the animal into a corner. The wolf sniffed the meat politely but showed no interest, instead choosing to nap in the shade of Martha's apple tree. Samuel Rodriguez, a former cavalry officer from Fort Apache, tried to approach with military precision, studying the wolf's patterns for weeks before making his move. The wolf seemed to understand his strategy perfectly and would always stay exactly 10 feet away, never closer, never farther. It was as if the animal could read human intentions with supernatural clarity. Even Thunder Pete, the legendary tracker who claimed he could catch any creature that walked, crawled, or flew, left Martha's ranch with his pride wounded and his reputation in tatters. The failures became so common that townspeople started placing bets on how long each new challenger would last. Most lasted less than an hour. The wolf never showed aggression, never bared its fangs or growled menacingly. It simply refused to be caught, moving with an almost mystical grace that made grown men question their abilities and their sanity. Then came the autumn morning when everything changed. Thomas McKenna rode into Tombstone on a paint horse that had seen better days. He wasn't particularly tall or muscular, didn't carry fancy weapons or wear expensive boots. At 23, Thomas had spent most of his life working small ranches across New Mexico and Colorado, earning just enough to keep moving. What set him apart wasn't his appearance but something in his quiet gray eyes, a patience that seemed deeper than his years. Martha first noticed Thomas when he stopped at Henderson's General Store to buy basic supplies. He didn't ask about her challenge like every other drifter who passed through town. He didn't stare when she walked past or whisper with the other men about her beauty or her mysterious past. Thomas simply tipped his hat politely and went about his business, which intrigued Martha more than all the bold proclamations and boastful challenges she'd heard over the years. Hook 2. What Thomas didn't know was that Martha had been watching him too, and what she saw terrified her more than any of the previous challengers. Because unlike the others, Thomas reminded her of someone she'd lost long ago. Someone whose death was the real reason behind her impossible challenge. 3 days passed before Thomas approached Martha's ranch. He didn't announce his intentions or make grand gestures. He simply appeared at her gate one morning, hat in hand, and asked permission to try catching her wolf. Martha studied his face carefully, searching for the usual signs of masculine bravado or hidden greed. She found neither. Instead, she saw something that made her heart skip, a gentleness that reminded her painfully of another young man who had stood in almost the same spot 5 years earlier. "You understand the rules?" Martha asked, her voice steadier than she felt. "No rope, no tricks, just you and the wolf." Thomas nodded. "I understand, ma'am." But I'd like to ask you something first. Why does it have to be without rope? What's special about that condition? The question caught Martha off guard. In all the months since she'd started the challenge, no one had asked her reasoning. They'd all been too focused on winning to wonder about her motivations. She found herself studying Thomas more carefully, noting the way he waited patiently for her answer. His hands relaxed at his sides. Because, Martha said slowly, trust can't be forced with bindings. What can't be earned freely isn't worth having. Thomas smiled then, and Martha felt her breath catch. That smile, warm and understanding, was achingly familiar. Then I reckon I'll need to earn his trust first. What happened next defied everything the townspeople expected. Instead of immediately pursuing the wolf, Thomas spent the entire first day simply sitting on Martha's porch steps. He didn't try to coax or call the animal. He didn't even look directly at it. He just sat quietly, occasionally whittling a piece of wood or humming softly to himself. The wolf, curious about this unusual behavior, began moving closer throughout the day, though it maintained its usual cautious distance. Martha watched from her kitchen window, preparing meals she barely touched, her mind racing with memories she tried desperately to forget. Thomas's patient approach reminded her so strongly of Daniel, her late husband, that she had to grip the windowsill to steady herself. Daniel had been the only person who could approach wild animals without frightening them. He'd had an almost magical way with creatures that others found dangerous or unpredictable. On the second day, Thomas brought a harmonica. He played soft melodies that drifted across the ranch like gentle morning mist. The wolf crept even closer, its ears pricked forward with interest. Martha recognized the songs, old folk tunes that Daniel used to play on his guitar in the evenings after long days working the ranch. The coincidence felt too strange to ignore, but Martha forced herself to stay inside, watching from behind her curtains. By the third day, the wolf was lying in the shade just 15 feet from where Thomas sat. They existed in comfortable companionship, neither threatening the other. Thomas would occasionally speak to the animal in low, conversational tones, as if they were old friends discussing the weather or sharing stories about their travels. Martha read the journal entries with trembling hands. Daniel had survived the flood, but he'd been badly injured. A blow to his head had stolen his memories, leaving him confused and lost. He'd lived like a hermit for months, slowly recovering bits and pieces of his past. By the time his memory fully returned, more than a year had passed. Shame and fear had kept him from going home. How could he explain his absence? How could he make Martha understand that he hadn't abandoned her intentionally? The final entries were the most heartbreaking. Daniel had been planning to return home for months, but each time he'd lost his nerve. He'd sent Shadow to watch over the ranch, to guard Martha from a distance while he struggled with his own demons. The wolf had been his messenger and his eyes, reporting back on Martha's well-being but never revealing Daniel's location. He's been protecting you all along, Thomas realized. That's why Shadow could never be caught. He wasn't supposed to be caught. He was supposed to keep everyone away from you until Daniel was ready to come home. The revelation explained everything, why the challenge had been impossible, why the wolf had shown no interest in the other men's attempts to capture him. Shadow had been following Daniel's orders, keeping potential suitors at bay while his master wrestled with his conscience and his fear. But why had Shadow brought Thomas to the ranch? What made him different from all the others? The answer came on their third day of searching, when they finally found Daniel himself. He was camped beside a small spring in a hidden valley, 20 miles from Martha's ranch. Years of outdoor living had weathered his face and streaked his dark hair with premature gray, but Martha would have recognized him anywhere. When he saw her approaching with Thomas and Shadow, Daniel's face went through a dozen emotions: shock, joy, fear, and overwhelming guilt. The reunion was everything Martha had dreamed of and nothing like she'd imagined. Daniel was alive, healthy, and still very much in love with her. But he was also broken in ways that had nothing to do with his physical injuries. The years of isolation and self-imposed exile had taken their toll on his spirit. "I didn't know how to come back," Daniel confessed, holding Martha as if she might disappear. "I'd been gone so long. I thought maybe you'd moved on, maybe you were better off without me. When Shadow told me about the challenge, about all those men trying to win your hand, I knew I'd waited too long. Thomas had been standing quietly nearby, giving them space for their reunion, but now Martha turned to him with sudden understanding. That's why Shadow brought you to me. Not to win the challenge, but to help me find Daniel. But how could he have known I'd be willing to help? Thomas asked. Daniel smiled for the first time since they'd found him. Because you didn't try to catch him for yourself. You tried to earn his trust because you wanted to understand, not because you wanted to win. Shadow's a good judge of character, always has been. The mystery was solved, but it created new complications. Martha was legally considered a widow. Her property had been managed under that assumption for 5 years. More importantly, she had to face the reality that the man she'd mourned and idealized might be different from the one who had returned to her. The journey back to Tombstone gave them time to talk, to rediscover each other, and to plan for a future that none of them had expected. Daniel was hesitant about returning to town, worried about the questions and explanations that would be required. Thomas offered to help however he could, but he also recognized that his role in their story was coming to an end. What will you do now? Martha asked Thomas on their last night camping under the desert stars. Thomas smiled, the same gentle expression that had first caught Martha's attention. I reckon I'll keep moving. There are other folks out there who might need help finding what they've lost. You could stay, Daniel offered quietly. The ranch is big enough for 3, and I owe you more than I can ever repay. I appreciate that, but I think my job here is done, Thomas replied. Besides, Shadow's got his real master back now. He won't be needing a temporary companion anymore. The wolf, lying between them around the campfire, lifted his head as if he understood the conversation. His amber eyes reflected the firelight as he looked from Thomas to Daniel to Martha, then back to Thomas again. Their return to Tombstone created the biggest sensation the town had seen since the gunfight at the OK Corral. People lined the streets to stare at the widow who wasn't a widow and the husband who had returned from the dead. The story spread quickly throughout the territory, becoming the stuff of legend within weeks. Martha and Daniel faced the legal and practical challenges of reestablishing their marriage and their lives. There were questions about property rights, insurance claims, and tax obligations that had been handled based on Daniel's presumed death. But they worked through each obstacle together, rebuilding not just their legal status but their relationship itself. Thomas stayed in town long enough to help with the initial complications, then quietly prepared to leave as he'd always planned. The night before his departure, Martha and Daniel invited him for dinner at the ranch house where this extraordinary chapter of their lives had begun. I still don't understand how you knew, Martha said as they sat on the porch where Thomas had first earned Shadow's trust. How did you know to be patient instead of trying to force a capture? Thomas was quiet for a long moment, looking out over the desert landscape painted purple and gold by the setting sun. My father used to say that some things in life can't be taken, they can only be given freely. Love, trust, loyalty. They all have to be earned through patience and understanding, not claimed through force. Wise man, your father, Daniel observed. He was. Lost him when I was 16, but his lessons stuck with me. Thomas stood up, preparing to take his leave. Speaking of lessons, I learned something important here too. What's that? Martha asked. Sometimes the thing someone thinks they want isn't really what they need. You thought you needed someone to catch your wolf and marry you. What you really needed was someone to help you find your husband. Shadow, who had been lying peacefully beside Daniel's chair, rose and padded over to Thomas. The wolf sat down in front of the young cowboy and offered his paw, a gesture of respect and gratitude that needed no translation. Thomas shook the offered paw solemnly. Take care of them, Shadow. They've got some lost time to make up for. As Thomas rode away the next morning, the entire town turned out to watch. He'd become something of a local legend himself, the cowboy who had solved the impossible challenge not by capturing the wolf, but by understanding what the wolf was really trying to accomplish. Martha and Daniel watched from their porch until Thomas disappeared over the horizon, heading north toward New Mexico. Shadow sat beside them, no longer needing to maintain his vigil or protect Martha from unwanted suitors. His mission was complete, his family reunited. The challenge that had stumped dozens of men for months had never really been about catching a wolf at all. It had been about finding the patience, wisdom, and selflessness to help two people find their way back to each other. Thomas McKenna had understood that instinctively, proving that sometimes the greatest victories come not from taking what we want, but from helping others reclaim what they've lost. Years later, travelers passing through Tombstone would still hear the story of Martha Caldwell's impossible challenge and the young cowboy who had solved it through kindness rather than conquest. Some versions of the tale claimed that Thomas had supernatural abilities, that he could speak to animals or see into the future. Others insisted that the wolf was actually Daniel himself, transformed by some ancient curse until true love could break the spell. But those who knew the real story understood that the truth was far more remarkable than any legend. It was a story about the power of patience over force, understanding over conquest, and the incredible things that can happen when someone cares more about helping others than about winning for themselves. Martha and Daniel rebuilt their life together, stronger for having faced the possibility of permanent loss. They raised cattle and horses on their ranch, and eventually children as well. Shadow lived out his days as the beloved family guardian he had always been meant to be, no longer torn between his loyalty to Daniel and his protective instincts toward Martha. And somewhere on the trails between Arizona and New Mexico, Thomas McKenna continued his wandering ways, carrying with him the knowledge that sometimes the most important victories are the ones where you help someone else win. His legend grew with each retelling, but the man himself remained humble, always ready to lend a hand to those who had lost something precious and needed help finding their way home. The story of the widow's wolf became a cautionary tale about the dangers of assuming we know what someone really needs, and an inspiring reminder that the most powerful force in the human experience isn't the ability to take what we want, but the wisdom to understand what others truly need and the courage to help them find it. In the end, Martha Caldwell's challenge had been answered not by the dozens of men who had tried to capture her wolf through strength and cunning, but by one young cowboy who had understood that the real test wasn't about catching anything at all. It was about having the patience to listen, the wisdom to understand, and the selflessness to put someone else's happiness above your own ambitions. The desert wind still carries whispers of their story across the Arizona territory, reminding all who hear it that sometimes the most impossible challenges have the simplest solutions, waiting to be discovered by those with eyes to see and hearts generous enough to care more about others than themselves. But the story doesn't end there. 20 years later, in 1907, when the Arizona Territory was preparing for statehood, a traveling journalist named Henry Whitmore arrived in Tombstone to document the changing times. The Wild West was fading into memory, replaced by railroads, telegraph lines, and the steady march of civilization. Yet among all the tales of gunfighters and gold prospectors, the story that captivated Whitmore most was the legend of Martha Caldwell and her impossible challenge. By then, Martha and Daniel were well into middle age, their ranch thriving with 3 children and dozens of grandchildren. Shadow had passed away peacefully in his sleep 5 years earlier, buried beneath the apple tree where he had once napped while watching hopeful suitors fail at Martha's challenge. The couple had become pillars of their community, known throughout the territory for their generosity and wisdom. Whitmore spent weeks interviewing townspeople, collecting dozens of versions of the story. Each telling had grown more elaborate with time. Some claimed the wolf had been as large as a horse. Others insisted it could speak human words. A few swore that Thomas McKenna had been an angel sent by God, while others believed he was a folk hero like Paul Bunyan or Pecos Bill. But when Whitmore finally sat down with Martha and Daniel on their familiar porch, now weathered by 2 decades of Arizona sun and wind, he discovered that the truth was far more extraordinary than any of the legends. The real miracle, Martha told him, her hair now silver but her green eyes still sharp, wasn't that Thomas caught Shadow. It was that he understood what Shadow was trying to tell us all along. Daniel, his beard now completely gray, nodded thoughtfully. That wolf spent months bringing men to our door, and we thought he was testing them. We never realized he was testing us. Testing you how? Whitmore asked, his pen poised over his notebook. By showing us what we'd been blind to, Martha replied. Every man who tried to catch Shadow was thinking only about what he wanted: my hand, my land, my fortune. Thomas was the first one who looked at the situation and asked what everyone else needed. Daniel leaned forward in his rocking chair, the same chair where Martha had once sat every morning to issue her challenge. Shadow knew I was alive. He'd been trying to bring me home for years, but I was too proud and too scared to come back. So he did the next best thing. He found someone who could help us find each other again. The journalist scribbled furiously, trying to capture not just their words, but the profound contentment that seemed to surround this couple who had found their way back to each other against impossible odds. What happened to Thomas McKenna? Whitmore asked. Martha and Daniel exchanged a knowing look. Oh, Thomas never really left, Daniel said with a smile. What do you mean? He settled down about 50 miles north of here, near Flagstaff. Married a schoolteacher named Rebecca, had 4 children of his own. He writes to us every Christmas, and we see him whenever business brings him this way. But more than that, Martha added, he changed how people think about solving problems. Word of what he did here spread throughout the territory. People started approaching their challenges differently. Instead of trying to force solutions, they'd ask themselves what Thomas McKenna would do. Whitmore looked up from his notes. And what would Thomas McKenna do? He'd listen first, Daniel answered. He'd try to understand what everyone really needed, not just what they said they wanted. He'd look for ways to help others instead of ways to help himself. Martha rose from her chair and walked to the porch railing, gazing out over the land that had seen so much joy and sorrow, so many failed attempts and one perfect solution. You know what the strangest part is? All those men who tried to catch Shadow, they were good men. Brave, strong, clever men. Any one of them could have made me a decent husband if I'd truly been looking for one. But you weren't looking for a husband, Whitmore observed. No, Martha said softly. I was looking for Daniel. I just didn't know it yet. Daniel joined his wife at the railing, taking her hand in his weathered fingers. And Shadow was looking for someone who could help us find each other. He just had to wait for the right person to come along. As the sun began to set over the desert landscape, painting the sky in brilliant shades of orange and purple, Whitmore packed up his notebook and prepared to leave. The couple had given him far more than just another frontier story. They'd given him a philosophy, a new way of looking at the challenges that face every human being. One last question, Whitmore said as he reached the gate. Do you ever wonder what would have happened if Thomas had never come to Tombstone? Martha and Daniel looked at each other, then back at the journalist. Shadow would have kept trying, Martha said with certainty. He never would have given up until he found someone who could help us. How can you be so sure? Daniel smiled, the same gentle expression that had first won Martha's heart all those years ago. Because love doesn't give up. Real love, the kind that lasts through floods and years of separation and impossible challenges. It always finds a way. As Henry Whitmore rode away from the Caldwell Ranch that evening, he carried with him a story that would eventually appear in newspapers across the nation. But more importantly, he carried a lesson that would influence how he approached every challenge for the rest of his life. The story of Martha Caldwell's impossible challenge became more than just a tale of the Old West. It became a parable about patience over force, understanding over conquest, and the incredible power of putting others' needs before our own desires. Throughout Arizona, then across the entire American frontier, people began to speak of doing it the Thomas McKenna way when faced with seemingly impossible problems. And on quiet evenings when the desert wind whispers through the sagebrush around Tombstone, old-timers still tell the tale of the widow who wasn't really a widow, the wolf who was never meant to be caught, and the humble cowboy who understood that sometimes the greatest victory comes not from winning, but from helping others find what they thought they'd lost forever. The challenge that had stumped dozens of men wasn't really a challenge at all. It was a prayer, spoken in the language of the heart, waiting for someone wise enough to understand its true meaning and generous enough to provide the answer it had been seeking all along.